My name is Leslie Thompson. I'm Director of Adult Programs at the Sid Richardson Museum, and I want to thank y'all for joining us this evening for our lecture program. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to first respectfully acknowledge all Native American peoples who've lived on this land since time immemorial. And I'd especially like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Wichita and affiliated tribes, which include the Waco, Kachai, Tawakoni, and Talvea, upon whose historical homeland I am conducting tonight's program. And while I recognize that a simple statement is insufficient to support the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples, I like to say a land acknowledgement to really remind myself to continue to educate myself and others on the past and present histories of Native communities in North Texas and beyond, like those represented in our collection, which leads me to the inspiration for tonight's lecture topic. At the SID, our current installation, our current exhibit is titled Picturing the American West. And it features a few different themes, and one of which is the theme centered around the lives of Plains Indians and the American bison. So when you walk into our main galleries, you'll see on the right side of the gallery a wall of paintings depicting buffalo hunts. And then on the opposite wall, you'll see a row of paintings, all of which are by Charlie Russell, and they depict Plains Indian women following the hunts and moving camp. And I thought that this pairing really, for me, sparked the question, what was the relationship between these complementary gender roles in Plains Indian societies? And so we have Dr. Ty Edwards with us tonight to shed a little light on that. And in particular, she's explored the gender roles among a specific Plains Indian tribe, that of the Osage. Before I introduce Dr. Edwards, I want to bring your attention to a couple of Zoom features. So I mentioned in my email to everyone this week that we can't see y'all. This is a Zoom webinar, not a Zoom meeting. So all of y'all's cameras are off. You can only see me and Ty. So we still want to hear from you, which is why I want to point out a couple of features. The first is the chat box. This is where you can leave a comment during the lecture, have a conversation with other attendees. And I want to point out too, in the to section of the chat box, there's a little drop down menu. If you want to be part of a larger conversation that everyone can see, make sure you select everyone. And I'm going to go ahead and test your skills with the chat box feature right now by asking you, if you are at home watching the lecture tonight with other people, if other people are there with you watching tonight, if you will go ahead and leave that number of people in the chat box. If it's more than just you at home watching tonight, that would really help me better accurately record attendance, since I really don't know how many people are behind each device that's logged in tonight. So I really appreciate that. So that's the chat box. But another feature I want to point out is the Q&A box. And this is where, if at any point during Dr. Edwards' talk, if you have a question, something sparks a question for you, beginning, middle, end, anytime, go ahead and type that question into the chat box. This will really help me collect them all in one place. So if you have a question, don't put them in the chat box, put that in the Q&A box. And then at the end of Dr. Edwards' presentation, I can go through the questions and share them with our speaker. So those are the two features I wanted to point out to you. But now I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker. Dr. Ty Edwards is a professor of history and the director of the Kansas Studies Institute at Johnson County Community College in the Kansas City metro area. Her research and teaching focuses on colonization, Indigenous Peoples, Gender, Disease, and U.S. History. Her book, Osage Women and Empire, which you see on the screen here, was published by University Press of Kansas in 2018. And she has also published scholarship on the role of colonization in undermining Indigenous health and facilitating the spread of epidemic disease. Her Kansas Studies work has involved a breadth of collaborations ranging from recording veterans' oral histories to helping document and preserve the Quindaro town site ruins, a stop on the Underground Railroad, working on repatriating a sacred boulder to the Kaw Nation and reimagining the city park where it stood for nearly a century, and many more wonderful projects. And this evening, Dr. Edwards will explore how women and men built the Osage Empire together, and how their system of gender complementarity served as a central site for experiencing, adapting to, and resisting the monumental change brought on by colonization. So with that, I'm going to mute my mic, Ty, and I will let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was a wonderful introduction. And I'm so excited to be with you all. I'm in Kansas. I know that Leslie's in Texas. I assume many of you might be there too, or at other wonderful places around our nation and perhaps the world. So a couple of things. This is an academic book, so it's published with the University Press. And they always ask that you let them know when you're doing events. And so I was letting them know that I had this event coming, and they were lamenting that you never sell books at virtual events. So they asked me if they could give me a discount code I could share with people watching if they wanted to buy the book. And of course, because I love my academic press and they're wonderful people, I said I would happily do that. So you can see that there's a 30% off and free shipping with my press if you want to order the book there. And then one other thing you can see on the right there, it says Kansas Open Books. One of the things my press has started doing is making some of their volumes open access, including some of their volumes on Indigenous history. So Kansas Open Books, those are, anyone could access them anytime for free, no login. And so I wanted to make sure to share that with you, because I bet a lot of you are readers, and that's something that's interesting to you. Okay, so real quick, this picture, I want to go over it. So this is the picture on the front of the book, and then it's also inside the book. So while visiting Fort Gibson in 1834, George Catlin painted numerous portraits of Osage people, including one of Arkansas Osage chief Claremore, and this portrait of his wife and child. Catlin described Wachite as richly dressed in costly cloths of civilized manufacture, which is almost a solitary instance amongst the Osage. However, Osage women had spent decades trading for European cloth and using it, along with skins, to fashion clothing out of a variety of materials. And then in the parting, if you see the painting in real life, so this is the color, right? So inside the book, it's black and white, so it's hard to tell. But you can see on her hair, she has the parting of her hair painted red. And the Osage were very devout in their religious practices. And one of the parts of their religious practice was women painting the parting of their hair, which tracked the movement of the sun over the horizon. And so you can see that she's doing that here in this painting, and that was part of the daily prayer vigil. And then, of course, she has a child, and children are going to be directly related to women's power in Osage life. And I will say, so Catlin's series of paintings, the others are all of men. And I think most of the others have been on the covers of books with the men in it, but I haven't ever seen an instance of the one with a woman that was on the front of a cover. So that's why it was important to me to make sure Wachite was on the front of this book. Okay, so a couple of things to point out. I'm in Kansas. Many of you are in Texas. My home state, Kansas, is named for a nation, the Kansa people. The Kansa people were expelled from this state eventually. You may know that their tribal headquarters for the Kaw Nation are now in the state of Oklahoma. And the reason for that, of course, is colonization. And so the things that I'm interested in are colonization, past and present. And for me, gender is a way to understand both the Indigenous experience and how colonization impacted that. I will also say that the academy and scholars have been agents of colonization themselves, and they have replicated and justified colonial hierarchies in their work and in their workplaces. And even though that is not my intent, I'm confident that I have not shed all the baggage that white Americans carry. And I want that to be acknowledged in this work. This is from a scholarly perspective, and it would be totally different if an Indigenous or Osage person were writing this. So that being said, I wanted to make sure I used a lot of Indigenous source material in this work. And the Osage, like many Indigenous people, are prolific at documenting their own history. And so the Osage have many authors from their nation who have written their histories. And these are just an example of some of them. And these are just some of the ones that I use in my work. So these are all Osage, I call them Osage scholars. So they're tribal citizens, members of that nation who have documented their own history from a variety of contexts. And one thing you might notice there too is that it's men and women, which shouldn't surprise us when we get to the end of this discussion. Okay, so first let me start off with gender is a construction. So if you haven't taken a history class in a long time, the way historians understand gender, and this is for all societies, okay, so gender for all societies is what we call a construction. And that means that every society constructs for itself how many genders there are, appropriate behaviors for each gender, and the power relations between them. Okay, so how many genders there are, appropriate behaviors for each, and power relations between. And that's different in every society, and then even in one society, that changes over time. So when we talk about Indigenous societies, especially North American Indigenous societies, we talk about what Leslie mentioned when she was doing the introduction, which is gender complementarity. Now, a lot of people might call that gender equality, and the reason why we use the term complementarity is men and women did different things. They had different jobs, different roles, different things that they controlled, different places where they got power. But those were not defined as different in terms of power. One was not more valuable than the other. So it's different roles, but equally valued. And so that's why we use the term complementarity. And I know that can be confusing. That's a kind of an academic-y way to describe it, but I wanted to explain. So for the Osage, like Indigenous people everywhere, especially in North America, their gender complementarity was embedded in their spirituality, their rituals, which included daily prayers, hunting and war preparation, corn planting, many other things. And you saw this gender complementarity in these other aspects of society. So I point that out because it's deeply rooted. Okay, this is really central to Osage identity. And so I wanted to kind of lay out to you what I mean by that, and then I'll go over this slide. So let me read you a little passage from the book that I think sets this up. Okay, and I should warn you, I'm going to be using some terms that in English mean things that aren't a perfect sort of corollary in Osage society. So like I'm going to use words like marriage and priesthood. That might not be exactly the term that would be equivalent, but I'm using it to represent something. The Osage priesthood organized Osage life based on the dual masculine and feminine forces they observed in celestial and seasonal cycles. Rituals required both male and female participation and defined a sexual division of labor without hierarchical difference. Spiritually, two things were necessary for continued national existence. One, women creating, and two, men protecting and providing. This meant women created future citizens, food, trade goods, and all the domestic items. Men killed game animals and enemies in warfare. Therefore, men and women worked together to guarantee the nation's future. Because of their different roles, each gender achieved status and power in distinct ways. Women were born with it, and men had to earn it. But life was not as strictly divided as one might think. In order for hunting to produce anything, men had to kill and women had to process. Warfare required male valor, but women ritually combined their courage with men's, and both were credited in victories. Men held political leadership positions as chiefs, but their authority was subordinate to the priesthood, which incorporated women in a variety of ways. In other words, men and women collaborated in virtually everything, and very little was strictly divided into separate spheres. So to show you a little more about what I mean, I have this slide here. So I have women and men. I should say this. So we have a decent amount of Osage spiritual rituals that are translated into English because an Omaha man named Francis LaFlèche in the early 20th century, the Omahas are a relative of the Osage, so they speak dialects of the same language. So he could speak to Osage people in their language. He worked for the federal government and he recorded a lot of Osage rituals and then translated them into English. He didn't record every ritual, but he did some of them, and they're some of the most detailed sources we have on any Indigenous nations rituals today. So that's who I'm quoting when I quote ritual. All right, so he defined women as the channel through whom all human life must proceed and continue. And women were believed to have the same mystic, sacred power of creating human life that the great mysterious, the great power, Wakanda also had, right? So women are a smaller version of that creative power. And as a result, women did reproductive, creative, life-giving work. So bearing and rearing of children seems kind of obvious, but to the Osage, that also meant women were skilled in being farmers. And many Indigenous nations, most Indigenous nations in North America, women were the ones who farmed if it was a farming nation, because they viewed raising crops as the same as raising children, right? You take seeds, you nurture them, and then you harvest them. And so agriculture was viewed a lot like motherhood. They also gathered food plants. They did the processing of meat and hides. That also was considered creative, right? You're taking something and creating something else. They constructed, and by the way, and owned lodges. They owned everything that they produced. And then they manufactured all the clothing and utensils used in the home. Okay, so now men. All right, so men. The life granted by Wakanda must be protected. The woman, the children she bears, the home she builds for their shelter and comfort, the fields she cultivates must be guarded. The land upon which the tribe depends for plant and animal food must be held against invasion. And the life of the individual of the tribe itself must at all times be defended from enemies. So I love how the English translation works here, right? What do? Men protect women's work. Right? That's the way it's phrased, right? Woman, the children she bears, the home she builds, right? The fields she cultivates. Just the way they're even saying that is centered on female production, and that's what men have to protect. So men's work was providing, protecting, and life-taking. The biggest difference between men and women's work is one is life-giving and one is life-taking. This is why women didn't engage in war, because it's counter to their spiritual reproductivity, right? They're in the life-giving business. And that's why men did hunting was, of course, taking a life, right? And so it was construed in that way. Diplomatic and war expeditions were in men's purview, and then men also manufactured all the tools necessary for their work, right? For warfare, for hunting, etc. Now, again, I'm portraying this as quite separate, right? But in reality, it wasn't that separate. So that's why I have here not entirely separate spheres. Spirituality and the economy embodied gender complementarity, but there were these overlaps. So probably the most obvious way is alternative genders. So you remember when I said gender is a construction, right? How many genders there are. The most common characteristic of Indigenous North American nations is what we call a multi-gender paradigm. This was common across North America. In other words, they believed in more than two genders, and their societies were constructed around more than two genders. So the way that I say it in my book is if you think about planet Earth, right, there's a North Pole and a South Pole, it's polarized. You should think about Indigenous gender in that same way. So in Osage gender, it's polarized by male and female, but there's this whole space between. And that space between left a lot of room for all different kinds of constructions. So people that were biologically born male that live female, people that are biologically born women living as men, but there's this between even that. So there were people that lived, there was someone who was, there's this famous example of someone who was born genetically male and lives most of his early life as a man. He's successful in warfare, and then he is spiritually instructed to start living as a woman. So he would live as a woman in peacetime, but in warfare, he would dress as a man and engage in warfare. So you see a lot of these complexities. And I think the important thing to remember is those complexities were embraced in the society and in their understanding of the world. So that was part of their society. But to get more practical, so cooking, we think of that as women's work in Osage societies. Women prepared meals, but there's lots of times where women are too busy, right? Especially during hunts when they're processing all the meat. And men didn't just starve to death, they cooked for themselves. And men were often away from women for long periods, hunting or going to war. They also cooked for themselves then. Agriculture was under women's control. Women farmed, they owned the fields and the produce that they produced, but men could work in the fields if they were under the direction of a woman. So women would often instruct their spouses or their sons or their brothers to go and clear fields at the beginning of planting season. And that didn't mean men were farmers. They were just doing jobs that women were telling them to do. All right, hunting, and this goes straight to Leslie's artworks and what she was mentioning. There's this big stereotype that hunting was all men's work, right? And the killing part is men's work, but all the rest of it, right? The thing that makes hunting worth anything, right? Food or trade goods was all women's work. That was creative and reproductive. So women turned carcasses into food and trade items. And that's how the Osage would have understood it. In war, men physically fought, but in Osage society, they used ritual to combine men and women's courage, and both men and women were credited in victories, in battle victories. In diplomacy, men held political leadership as chiefs, but women contributed to diplomacy through hospitality and feast preparation, which was a big part of the way they engaged with foreigners. And then the priesthood. Again, this is a Western term, but think of spiritual leadership. In Osage society, the priesthood was preeminent in all matters, and in order for someone to become a priest, they had to be a married couple that were initiated together, and then widows could fulfill their husband's role if he died. And there are many rituals that were never translated into English, and so it's believed that some of those were about women being independent members. Men, on the other hand, couldn't join the priesthood without a wife, right? So you can see how she can be a religious leader after his death, but he couldn't join without a woman. So again, these ideas of things being separate aren't as separate as they seem, right? There's a lot of things that overlap here. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of the context of Osage history. So I'm focusing mostly on the era right before colonization and then during early colonization. So 18th century Osage life. So originally, the Osage are not in close proximity to Europeans. And when the French in particular are colonizing, especially in what we would call Canada, they have goods that Indigenous people find valuable, a lot of trade goods that Indigenous people want access to. But the Osage are physically far away, and so they don't have direct access. So they had to rely on other Indigenous nations who lived closer to the French. And so a native nation that controlled goods and moved them from a European colonizer out to other Indigenous people, we call a middleman nation, right? So they were middlemen in trade. So the Osage were not in that position. They had to rely on middlemen in trade. So the thing that they originally traded with other natives, and then those goods got to Europeans in order for the Osage to get European goods, was women's agriculture. So it was actually agricultural produce that the Osage had in surplus. So that's women's labor, right? That's women's goods. And the French loved that because the French were notoriously not farming when they came to North America, because they were like, why should we? The natives do it so well. We can just trade for the food we need. Why should we grow anything? So women's agriculture was central to early French trade. And the Osage were like many North American Indigenous peoples. They planted multi-crop fields. Corn, beans, and squash being the main ones, but not exclusive. And corn was very spiritually and ceremonially significant to the Osage as one of their primary food sources. So I wanted to read you a little bit here about the context of women and corn, so you can understand why this is so important to them. Let me read you a little bit here. Okay. Where am I? Here we go. Ceremonial celebrations continued when women began harvesting the green corn, acknowledging women's food production, creative power, and Wakanda's favor. During this jubilant time, children cheered, "Corn is ripe!" Scores of Osage repeated the cry and ran onto the cornfields. For now, all Osages could gather roasting ears, as many as they could eat. In the village, fires were soon burning and corn was being roasted by every family. All day long, the feast continued. They danced the green corn dance and sang of the goodness of the Great Spirit and the faithfulness of the Osage. Only the annual first appearance of bison accorded the same community-wide level of excitement, illustrating how the complementarity of food sources, bison and corn, remained emblematic of their cosmological understanding and gender construction. So again, this duality, right? This idea of women and men and this dual forces also is manifested in food. Bison and corn being the premier foods that sort of balance each other as well. Okay, so this is part of Osage society even before Europeans arrive, and even with trade, this isn't being undermined. So my major argument in my book is that gender is deeply embedded in the Osage worldview and in their spirituality. And gender and its duality manifested in their lives and experiences, and they believe that survival and success required both women and men. I then argue that women and men cooperated to build an Osage empire after they have closer access to the French, and that they used this empire to resist colonization. Gender was a central site for experiencing and resisting colonization, but I should say over time, the toll of colonization will be brutal, and I'll talk about that a little bit too. So this is sort of the context of that, right? So how does colonization, as they become closer to Europeans, manifest? So by the time we get to the 1720s, this is decades after they've been trading with the French indirectly, right? The 1720s, the Osage will have direct access to French trade. And this is what will lead to the growth of the Osage Empire. If you see on my map, right, there's the smaller area and then there's the larger area. The larger area is the expansion that happens after the 1720s. So let me read to you really quick about how that was constructed. French trading posts built close to Osage communities in the 1720s facilitated direct access to European goods and an end to Osage dependence on other native middlemen. Archaeological excavations of mid-18th century Osage towns indicated European traders supplied guns, beads, kettles, knives, square nails, awls, hoes, and axes. Becoming middlemen themselves, the Osage then traded similar goods to more western and southern indigenous communities, acquiring horses, slaves, skins, and meat in the process to trade with the French or utilize internally. Scholars credit the large Osage population, an estimated 10 to 18,000, as enabling significant and rapid expansion across the region during this period. For the Osage, this population was a product of Wakanda's favor and women's fertility, a creative power. They literally had the manpower to expand their hunting and raiding range while preventing native rivals and French traders from having contact. By the 1750s, Osage-French trade expanded at the expense of their former Illinois trading partners, who complained that the French traders saved all the best goods for exchange with the Osage. A significant part of Osage power involved the fur and hide trade. To supply French traders and obtain valuable goods in return, the Osage expanded their hunting territory over 3 ecological zones internal to or bordering their homeland: plains, prairies, and the Ozark Mountains. The territory produced a wide variety of peltry and hides, from deer, elk, bison, bears, wolves, raccoons, foxes, wildcats, weasels, and muskrats. Osage hunting lands covered an estimated 100,000 square miles, encompassing the present-day state of Missouri, half of Arkansas, and portions of Oklahoma and Kansas. Though the Osage hunted beaver, the mild winters in this region prevented local beavers from producing the thick pelts of their Canadian counterparts. In the 18th century, the most lucrative hide trade derived from deerskins, which required more extensive female labor in tanning and trimming than beaver peltry. Without a doubt, the laborious and time-consuming hide processing and corresponding meat production added to an Osage woman's workload. Excavations of an 18th century Little Osage town identified large flint scrapers used in tanning hides as the most abundant native-made artifacts in the entire site, and iron awls, or needles, as one of the most prolific European-made objects. As their processing work grew, to save time and labor, women increasingly consumed European goods, such as iron awls, kettles, and cloth, and then utilized these items in the rest of their still voluminous domestic production. Nevertheless, women did not full-scale abandon native-made goods, such as stone hide scrapers or skin clothing, which remained commonplace well into the 19th century. One Euro-American observer noted after visiting an Osage community, "It is to their women's industry and ingenuity that the men owe every manufactured article of their dress, as well as every utensil in their homes." So you can see how just massively productive this is, right? So in order for the Osage to grow in power, they needed a large population. They had a large population, they believed, because of women's power, right? And then they leveraged this into a trading empire. All right, now many scholars have argued, or they've implied, that when the Osage built this territory of control and were so powerful in trade, that it must have led to a decline in women's roles. And that's what led me to this project, is I was reading some really amazing scholarship that was really good until I got to the part where they're like, but probably women became less equal, right? And you're like, why? That doesn't make sense, right? From the Osage perspective, you can only be successful if you have gender complementarity. They would not abandon it, right? They would have attributed their success to both men and women's work. And you can see that when you look at both genders. However, if you're building a big empire, some things are going to have to change, right? There's going to have to be social adjustment. So one of the things is the nation increasingly decentralized. The major unit of Osage life was the town. So you have every clan represented in a town. Every town has local leadership. Osage towns could have 1,000 people in them. They were quite large. And then you can see the Little Osage, the Great Osage, and the Arkansas Osage. And those are just regions of towns. So you have a really large decentralized nation. Okay, matrilocal residence. That means when a couple marries, they live with the woman's family. We know the Osage were patrilocal before colonization. They lived with, after a marriage, a woman lived with her husband's extended family. But that changes in the 18th century. And we believe that's because hunting and war expeditions were all men of the same clan. And because they were hunting and warring so often and successfully here, men would be gone from the household for weeks at a time. So you didn't want a household to be without the food provision, right, and its protection for an extended period. So it looks like they adjusted to living with the woman's family. And if you're living with the woman's family, the men that are married to all of those women would be from different clans. So they would go on hunting and war expeditions at different times. Plural marriages, what some people call polygamy or polygyny, that also grew in this period. I should note that in Osage society, women had complete sexual freedom. So household creation was not the same as sexual exclusivity. And women and men could both initiate divorce at any time with retaining their property. It was not a dramatic turn of events. Even though it was relatively uncommon, it was still accepted. And so plural marriages didn't imply a loss of power. And in order for a man to have multiple wives, he had to be extremely successful because he had to have enough ability to produce food and supply and protect that household. And from a woman's perspective, the labor in this period was so high that women would then be in the same household doing labor together. And a man marrying into that household wasn't much of a burden because women were already doing this work together. And then lastly, the Osage did not intermarry with the French until after the end of the French and Indian War. So you may know the French and Indian War, which ends in 1763, officially removes the French from North America for the most part, even though a lot of French people physically stayed. After that happened, that was going to change trade relationships, right? The Osage were going to have to trade with some other nation. And so after the French presence is officially ended, that's when the Osage start intermarrying with the remaining French traders in order to solidify kinship and to solidify trade relationships. So they don't even intermarry with the French early on. It's decades after their trade empire that they do that. And then there's this great discussion about how this was a time in Osage life of general happiness. So I just want to read you how joyful this period was. And I should say this is from a Euro-American outside observer, so he does use some racist and offensive language in this description. In August 1811, Fort Osage factor George C. Sibley observed over 1,000 people in an Osage hunting camp in the full and free indulgence of all the luxuries of their rude condition. He noted an absence of illness and an abundance of supplies, including buffalo, elk, deer, marrow bones, tongues, hominy, beans, dried pumpkin, plums, and other dainties. Men's hunting and women's meat production, cultivation, and gathering produced this bounty. Vigilant elder warriors maintained camp security, while elder women were busily employed jerking and curing on scaffolds the flesh of the fat buffalo. Young men and women adorned in the highest style of fashion mingled in small groups. Older boys tended the horses, many girls aided their mothers, and swarms of children swam in the creek or frolicked on the prairie. Sibley concluded, mirth and hearty merriment prevailed. Never had I witnessed such general happiness in any community as prevailed here. These observations demonstrate how, even after a century of colonization, in many ways, Osage life continued to follow a familiar and clearly flourishing cycle. Not surprisingly, some aspects of their society changed to facilitate this. Nevertheless, gender complementarity remained a central aspect in both material and ritual life as men and women cooperated to build the Osage Empire. So, in other words, the argument I'm making is that as long as their agriculture, hunting, and trade economy remained intact, everything that informed that, their spirituality, their gender roles, also remain intact. Okay, so you have hunting, agriculture, trading economy that's built into spirituality and gender, and those things will exist together as long as you see them continue. All right, so the biggest change that comes to Osage life is that the United States colonization is fundamentally different than their experience with French and Spanish colonization. Okay, it's different in almost every way. So first, the French were what we call a trading empire. So there are French colonists that come, but the way that the French primarily make money from their colony is through trade. And they trade with indigenous people for goods and then sell those goods, which means natives are really important to the French colonial enterprise. The British, when they colonized North America, and the United States is going to be similar. So the British are like this, and then the United States, after its independence, will do the same, are what we call settler colonial empires. And a settler colonial empire needs indigenous people to go away. So the way the scholarship says is indigenous people need to be eliminated so that settlers can possess indigenous land. All right, so settler colonizers are colonists that are coming to stay, and they want indigenous resources, specifically land. So that's the kind of empire the British were in North America, and the United States will be the same. So after the American Revolution, settler colonialism is really accelerated in the Appalachian Mountains, in the Ohio Valley. And so you see a lot of indigenous nations from those areas fleeing, almost as refugees, if you will, from the eastern part of the continent, closer to the Mississippi River. So if you look at my map here, you can see on the right, Sac and Fox, Kickapoo, Delaware, Shawnee, and then to the southeast, Cherokees. These are nations that are intentionally moving away from areas where Americans are colonizing, where Americans are spreading their population. The trouble is when these indigenous nations move west, they're moving into land dominated by other indigenous nations, and in this case, the Osage. So the Osage will view these native nations as invaders, as encroachers, as enemies. And all of these native people will be using the same land to try to feed and house more people. So there will be more competition for natural resources and more conflict as a result. So in this context, you may know, while Thomas Jefferson is president, right, the Louisiana Purchase happens, and then pretty rapidly the Lewis and Clark expedition is sent across the continent. And contrary to our sort of mythic view of Lewis and Clark, Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark intentionally to enact right of discovery, which means enact what was considered the legal norm in Europe at the time of the United States being the dominant empire over that land. And so Lewis and Clark do a very specific set of things that empires all over the world are doing at the time to ensure what appears as dominion. So indigenous people will have some independence, but they are, it's believed to be a subservient independence to the empire that is claiming that land, which in this case is the United States. So Lewis and Clark were instructed by Jefferson that when they got into what we would now call Missouri, that they were supposed to cultivate positive relationships with the native nations there, especially the powerful ones like the Osage, because Jefferson's plan was to move more natives into this land and move them out of the land where Americans wanted to live. So the first native, and Jefferson wanted Lewis and Clark to send natives to visit him, all right, so to send them to Washington, D.C. So the first natives that were sent to Washington, D.C. to meet Jefferson are Osage leaders. And by 1807-08, so Jefferson isn't even out of office yet. Jefferson is still president, and now American settlements are being founded on Osage land. And the Osage will, of course, also view this as invasion. And this will lead to the Treaty of 1808. So these same three guys are really important players here, Jefferson, Lewis, and Clark. So let me just read you really quick what happens in this treaty. This is the first treaty of the Osage with the United States. The Treaty of 1808 was a classic example of treaty coercion. As Jefferson had instructed, Clark abruptly demanded land cessions when Osage leaders thought they were meeting to discuss other matters. In this case, invasion by and retaliation against American settlers. Negotiations were only conducted with a few great and little Osage leaders who did not have the authority to make land cessions, and the entire nation was expected to abide by the treaty's provisions. And finally, Clark flatly lied about what was in the treaty. He allegedly admitted to a friend that, quote, it was the hardest bargain against the Indians he ever made, and that if he was to be damned hereafter, it would be for making that treaty. The Osage leaders were led to believe that they had agreed to share some territory with Euro-American hunters in exchange for land payments, goods, blacksmith services, plows, a grain mill, a new trading factory, Fort Osage, and federal military protection against rival natives. However, Clark, Lewis, and Jefferson claimed the Osage had ceded their title to an extent of country nearly equal to the state of Virginia and much more fertile, on which refugee natives and Americans would settle. Osage leaders were already voicing their displeasure to Lewis about this fraudulent acquisition of 52 million acres before he had even mailed the treaty to the president. But it was to no avail. Osage historian Lewis Burns concluded, considering that all forms of compensation for these lands totaled less than 1/6 of a cent per acre, it is reasonable to suspect that someone was cheated. So the Osage do not have hospitable memories of Lewis and Clark because of this. And then by 1825, there's another treaty in 1825, and this eliminates the Osage from their homeland. So all of their towns are in either Missouri or what we would today call Oklahoma and Arkansas. And they are expelled from these areas and confined to a reservation in Kansas. Now, they had hunted in Kansas, but they had never farmed in Kansas. For a reason. Okay, so quickly here going to Kansas. They are confined to southeastern Kansas, by their standards, a very small strip of land. When they move to Kansas, it takes them 5 years to decide where to build their towns and do their farming, because where they're confined to is such a bad area for agriculture, and Osage women knew this. They also experience repeated drought, repeated flood, and multiple grasshopper plagues when they are moved to Kansas, which destroys all their crops. Okay, so I think Leslie mentioned on a side note, I also do scholarship on disease. One of the things you need to know is Indigenous people did not die of epidemic disease because it was new to them, because they had no experience. They don't die of epidemic disease until their lives are undermined by colonization in other ways. So the Osage had been trading with Europeans, marrying with Europeans, living with Europeans for almost a century by this point. And it's not till the 1820s when they're expelled to Kansas that they start dying of epidemic disease. And disease is especially deadly to women. So when women die, population growth is hindered, right? Because women are the fertile members of society. So women and children were particularly vulnerable in these epidemics, and that's going to impact population long term. Because their agriculture is unreliable in Kansas, they have to rely more on hunting and trade, which means they have to move more, right? They have to be away from home for longer periods to do that hunting and trade. And now they're the people that are moving into land that other indigenous people control, right? Now they are viewed as invaders for Western nations like the Cheyenne or the Apache or the Comanche. And those nations are all competing over the bison herds. And then 1850s is when the settler invasion happens in Kansas. And this is even more traumatic. I call the 1850s the deadliest decade for the Osage. So I want to just give you a little idea of how desperate this was in Kansas. The greatest challenge the Osage faced in Kansas came from settler colonialism. As early as March 1853, more than a year before the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, which officially created Kansas Territory, a congressional Indian appropriations bill included an authorization for the President of the United States to enter into negotiations with Indian tribes west of the states of Missouri and Iowa for the purpose of securing the assent of said tribes to the settlement of the citizens of the United States upon the lands claimed by said Indians, and for the purpose of extinguishing the title of said Indian tribes in whole or in part to said lands. The goal of native elimination could not be clearer. The federal government had just signaled to eager speculators and squatters that native land rights in Kansas were temporary, and if settlers wanted access to this newly available land, they should move now, and they did. By the time Congress debated the Kansas-Nebraska Act a year later, natives faced significant settler invasion. One missionary noted that squatters were not very particular about keeping in the lines, never caring about the limits of the Osage Reservation. From this point on, missionaries and government agents documented settlers coming into the region daily, disregarding reservation boundaries, building homes, tilling fields, destroying food and timber sources, stealing horses, and using violence, including murder, to gain Osage land and resources. Speeches delivered by so-called leading men and newspaper articles further convinced settlers that Indians have no rights which should be respected by white men. Settlers generally associated in clubs, pledged to defend each other in occupation of claims, created their own militias, organized at least 3 counties entirely inside the Osage Reservation, and then applied to the governor for protection. All the while, Indian agents repeatedly requested the use of military force to guarantee reservation boundaries and remove the squatters. But the neglect of the federal government to assert the supremacy of law over a few border men, professional squatters, was regarded as a tacit approval of criminal acts by men professing to be just and honest. Hence, more settlers perpetrated the same crime, claiming the right to do what was allowed by others. But would the federal government bother enforcing temporary land rights? Congress had already made it clear that natives in Kansas would be eliminated, and if settlers were willing to do the work, why not let them? All of this exhibited the systemic nature of U.S. imperialism. In other words, invasion is a structure, not an event, and therefore elimination is an organizing principle of settler colonial society, rather than a one-off occurrence. In other words, this is how it was meant to function, and it functioned this way repeatedly. The settler invasion is really hard in terms of gendered work. So settlers stole crops. That's the product of women's work. They stole dried crops, which women would bury to use at different times of year. They would steal it straight from the fields, or they would let their livestock graze in Osage fields. They would rob graves. In Kansas, women were in charge of burial, and they buried Osage people with objects they would need and food they would need to travel to the afterlife. So the way I say it in the book is settlers were harassing the living and the dead. And then they also dismantled and occupied Osage homes. Those were the product of women's labor. Women owned them. And then they stole horses, up to 5 to 20 head a day for 2 decades. And this all undermines Osage men's ability to protect their women and to protect women's work. So you can see that all of this is assaulting gendered work. And then land loss is extreme for the Osage in 1863 to 1872, and with land loss comes population loss. So you can see this, this map shows all of the treaties that have happened through the 1870s. So you can see their population is really sizable. French colonization does not undermine population. It's not until they're confined to Kansas that population declines. And then you can see basically genocidal death rates, right? You can see the sort of unbelievable population loss that happens in Kansas specifically. So this is brutal, right? This is what I mean by colonization is really brutal for the Osage. And so how do we make sense of this? I have one last section to read you from the book. Their time in Kansas was important because the Osage effectively used their religious and economic structure built on gender complementarity to control and direct change. With all of their struggles in Kansas, this should have been the period when the Osage people became culturally or literally extinct. As Patrick Wolf has argued, settler colonialism destroys to replace. The United States needed the elimination of the natives in order to establish itself on their territory. The pressure just to survive was intended to make the Osage and all indigenous people acquiesce to demands by federal agents and missionaries to change everything. Osage women should have been subjugated as men became farmers and everyone adopted Christianity, or the destruction and despair of it all should have killed them. But that did not happen. Maintaining gendered work and the corresponding religious practices in still relevant ways preserved their social structure that had long used self-directed adaptations to persist and even thrive in a changing world. In Kansas, they made some changes to their economic and ritual practices in light of new circumstances. However, many of the old ways, though severely challenged, were the best methods of survival. In Oklahoma, things were different, and that was where they made more significant changes. Nevertheless, the longevity and solidarity the Osage Nation has today would never have happened if they had become assimilated, sedentary Christian farmers in Kansas. And that is why aspects of gender complementarity still connect the modern Osage with their imperial ancestors. Thank you. I can't wait to hear your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. I know that's just like a small sample from your book and from your work, but I really appreciate it. We already have had a couple of questions come in. For those of you who have questions, go ahead and type those into the Q&A box, and I will share them as I see them. But one of the first questions we got was actually back in the beginning when you were talking about the roles of men and women. And Mary Ellen asked, what about responsibilities with respect to raising and educating children?
Right. So there's these great, women were in many ways in charge of children when they were very young. And then it depended on the gender of the child when they got to, what we might call the preteen age. And as they got to the preteen age, then their gender sort of determined who they started learning from. So if you were male, you might start learning from your father or your uncles, your grandfather. And you saw sort of like increasing responsibilities. So like boys would take care of horses, for example. They would be in charge of caring for horses. Because if women were in charge of caring for horses, they'd have to stop farming, and that, didn't make sense. So you see sort of graduating responsibility. But the Osage are famous amongst the white people that lived around them for how much they loved their children, that they were deeply loving to their children. I mean, even by the standards of the day. So this is part of why they didn't send their kids to the missionary schools very much. They did not want to part with their children. So women were considered the repositories of knowledge. And I have some great stories in the book about how women raised their children, how women loved their children. Even when the kids would go to the missionary schools, their moms would camp next door. Like they were just not going to leave their kids. And sometimes kids that did go, their grandmothers would come and get them. A lot of times, though, we think about in the very laborious times, right? So when women are processing those hides and, processing meat, a lot of times grandparents are the main caregivers to the children during that period. And so because the sort of adults, right, the young adults in the prime of life are doing so much of the physical labor. So you would really think of it as a multi. You know who your immediate parents are, but you're being parented by both a grandparent generation and by your aunts and uncles. So it is a true sort of extended family raising of the children. And people are living in very large houses that have multiple family units in it. So you are, I should have put, I have some artist rendering of what Osage houses look like, but they're long houses. They're built structures. They're not teepees. And so you have multiple families in that same building. And so you're gonna in many ways be parented by your aunts and uncles and your grandparents who live in the same household with you.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. We also had a question. Were these the Osage Indians of the Laura Ingalls books?
Yes. So it's funny that you say that because there's this great article that's called, it's about Laura Ingalls' books, especially when they're in Kansas. When they're in Kansas, the Ingalls are squatting on the Osage Reservation. So there's this English professor who calls it Little Squatter on the Osage Reservation instead of Little House on the Prairie, because that's what they are. And it is really interesting to think about that because, and I've looked back at some of her books, which, were written much later than when those events supposedly happened. But if you look at them, there is some stuff in those children's books that really Laura is challenging her father. Why do we deserve to have this land and they don't? And I'd be curious how people could answer those questions even today. She posits the questions, she doesn't answer them, but her father and that family is a great example of many American settler colonizers, right? They're poor. They're coming out to get free land. They're squatting because they want to improve their own status. But to improve their own status, right, we have to eliminate indigenous people in their land and their land ownership. So yeah, the Ingalls story is a great example of how this all worked, and that is absolutely one of the nations they had contact with.
Interesting. Okay, good question. Let's see. Another question: did the Minnesota Massacre and railroads coming into their lands affect the demise of the Osage?
So you mean just railroads in general coming in? Read that to me again, Leslie.
It sounds like it. Did the Minnesota Massacre and railroads coming into their lands affect the demise of the Osage?
Yeah, so I guess railroads were a big issue. So the railroads would commit massive fraud to try to get access to indigenous land. So one of the removal treaties that was supposed to remove the Osage onto what was called a diminished reservation in Kansas, so they had to, even lose more land while they were in Kansas, was illegally negotiated, supposedly between the Osage to transfer their land entirely to a railroad company. And this happened in American history in other contexts, but the Osage case was so flagrant that actually there ended up being a huge controversy in Congress, and the Senate wouldn't approve the treaty because it was viewed to be fraud. So that ends up creating all these other problems because everyone locally in Kansas thinks that the Osage are being moved again. Well, Congress isn't approving the treaty because it's fraudulent, but there's years between when it was negotiated and when Congress refuses to ratify it. So there's massive invasion, right? So the Osage don't know where to live. Like, do we move to what do we do? We haven't been paid. And so it makes just the settler invasion worse. So in a lot of ways, you could argue that railroads and settlers are kind of working in tandem here. But the railroad story in Kansas is big. A lot of indigenous land is lost ultimately to railroads, even if it isn't directly so.
Okay. I know we're technically at time, but I'm gonna.
Oh, keep going.
I'm gonna do a few more questions. I'm gonna kind of combine these as kind of like the finisher here, because I think they might go well together. But there's, I wonder if you can talk about the current state of the Osage people, if there's an effort to protect the heritage of the Osage, and then if you want to also weave in how you became interested in Osage women.
Yes. So, absolutely, the Osage Nation is thriving and large, and I would encourage everyone to go out to the Osage Nation's website. It's a really great way to kind of get access to Osage life today. And do I have it on here? I thought, oh yes, their website is Osage Nation, and maybe I'll type it in the chat for you. Let's see, Osage Nation-nsn.gov. Yeah, so I highly recommend that you go to their website. And by the way, any Indigenous nation, I recommend going to their website. I've never seen an Indigenous nation that doesn't have a history and culture section on their website. And it's a really great way to get the tribe's view of their history. But the Osage Nation is more populous now than we think it was at the time of colonization. They have robust government. They have robust cultural programs. They own some sacred mounds in the state of Missouri that the tribe has acquired in order to preserve some of their sacred sites in their old homeland. So the Osage they have amazing language programs. It's just a really thriving nation. They have citizens that live all over the country, not only where their tribal headquarters is in Oklahoma. So in many ways, you see a lot of the things that I was talking about manifested in modern Osage culture that functions as a federally recognized tribe today that thrives in many ways. So I encourage, they have a wonderful tribal museum. If you're ever in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, I highly recommend going to it. It's well done. It's been woman run for many, many years. It's just a great example of the preservation of their own history and many things that I didn't even mention that are really wonderful and excellent. So yes, I recommend you doing that. And the second part of that question, how did I get interested?
Yes.
So there's a great book. There's a great book that I recommend anyone read called Native Ground, and it's by Kathleen Duval. And this is really great work. And it's about many tribes. Osage, Quapaw, Comanches are in this. Caddoan peoples, you were talking about the affiliated Wichita tribes. Leslie, if you're into that, this would be a great book. So Kathleen Duval wrote this great book, and it's all about Indigenous power. And I was reading it, and when you're reading a book and you're just eating it up, you're like, oh my God, this is like the best book I've ever read. I just delight in this book. And then I got to, I wish I could, let's see if I can turn right to the page because, I'm so angry about it. I was reading this book and I get to page 127 and here's what it said. It says, while war and the hunt had informed Osage masculinity in earlier times, now the unprecedented success of both increased their importance. Men's valor had changed Osage history. While women's economic importance remained strong, through preparing hides, working in hunting camps, and continuing to farm, their place probably became less central than in the past. And I was like, what? Why? Like, when you're following along, you're just like, yes. And it's one of these throwaway paragraphs at the end of a chapter, that it doesn't even have a citation, and I just was reading that in graduate school and I was like, I just don't believe that. So I wanted to see how the argument she has in this book about power would look if we looked at it in a gendered lens, but a gendered lens that really was men and women, not just the experience of women. So that's how I got interested in it. I knew before that I wanted to do something related to Indigenous people, and I wanted it to be somehow Kansas related because I was going to graduate school in Kansas, and I'm from Kansas. And so that's how it happened.
The origin story. Well, thank you so much, Ty.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So fascinating. I don't know about y'all at home, but I learned so much tonight in just this short talk. And if you are interested in learning more, because there is definitely a lot more to hear, definitely check out Ty's book, Osage Women in Empire. Goes into much more depth. But I hope that this was a fascinating way to start off your weekend, everyone. And I hope y'all have a good night. Thank y'all for coming out.
Thank you so much.